In the spring of 1796, the most powerful man in America used the government of the United States to hunt down a 22-year-old woman. He was the president. He had commanded the army that won the country's independence. His face would end up on the money in the mountain. And he spent the last years of his life quietly trying to recover one enslaved woman who had walked out of his house during dinner and refused, across every offer and every agent he sent, to come back. He never caught her. She outlived him. She outlived his wife. She lived 50 more years in a cold farmhouse on the New Hampshire coast, poor enough that the county had to help support her, and near the end of her life, 2 reporters found her and asked whether she regretted it, whether she was sorry she had traded a comfortable place in the household of George Washington for poverty and hardship and a life spent looking over her shoulder. She said no. She said, "I am free." Her name was Ona Judge. This is her story. Welcome to Behind the Throne. Start with the house she left, because the house is the thing that makes the rest of it almost impossible to believe. In May of 1796, the executive mansion of the United States was a brick house on Market Street in Philadelphia, which was then the capital. George Washington lived there. He conducted the business of the presidency there, and enslaved people ran the house, cooked in it, cleaned it, waited at its tables, inside the residence of the man who governed a republic founded on the words, "All men are created equal." There were around 8 enslaved people from Mount Vernon in that house. One of them was a young woman, about 22 years old, who served as Martha Washington's personal maid. She dressed her, she arranged her hair, she managed her wardrobe and traveled at her side and slept where she could be summoned. She was, in the language of the household, Mrs. Washington's body servant, the most intimate and trusted enslaved position in the entire establishment, close enough that many people in Philadelphia society would have recognized her on sight. On the evening of May 21st, 1796, while George and Martha Washington sat down to dinner, that young woman walked out the door and disappeared into the city. She had planned it. This is one of the things her own words make clear, and we have her own words, which is rarer in this kind of story than you might think. Decades later, she described it plainly. While the Washingtons were packing to return to Virginia, she was packing too. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she was not going back to Virginia. She had friends among the free black people of Philadelphia. She had her things carried to them ahead of time, and then she left the president's house while the family was eating dinner. She was gone before they knew to look. To understand why a woman would walk away from the safest, most comfortable position available to an enslaved person in America, the personal maid of the First Lady living in the capital, dressed well, spared the field, you have to go back to where she came from. And you have to understand what she had just learned. Ona Judge was born around 1773 at Mount Vernon, Washington's plantation on the Potomac in Virginia. Her mother, Betty, was an enslaved seamstress, a skilled woman, valuable, one of the enslaved workers Martha Washington had brought into the marriage from her first husband's estate. Ona's father was a white Englishman, an indentured servant named Andrew Judge who worked as a tailor on the plantation. Under Virginia law, the status of the child followed the status of the mother. Her father was a free man working off a contract. Her mother was property. So Ona was property. The arithmetic had been done before she was born. She grew up inside the machinery of Mount Vernon, and she grew up skilled because her mother's trade passed down. By the time she was 10, she was a capable seamstress. She was brought into the mansion house as a girl, and her ability with the needle and her competence around the family moved her up into the most personal service. When Washington was elected president in 1789 and the household moved north, first to New York, then to Philadelphia, Ona Judge went with them as Martha's maid. She was one of the enslaved people the most powerful family in the country could not do without on a daily basis. And that is the part worth sitting with, because it cuts against the story America likes to tell about house slaves. The position was not a kindness. It was proximity without freedom. Ona Judge spent her days inches from the wife of the President of the United States, handling her clothes and her hair and her private routines, and she could be given away at any moment to anyone for any reason because she was listed among the assets. In 1796, she found out she was about to be. Martha Washington had a granddaughter named Elizabeth Eliza Parke Custis, and in that year Eliza was getting married. Martha decided on a wedding gift. She would give Eliza a maid. She would give her Ona. Ona knew Eliza Custis. And by the accounts that survive, including the read that historians have taken from Ona's own decisions, Eliza had a reputation, a temper, a cruelty, a character that promised a far harder life than the one Ona had in Philadelphia. To be handed to Eliza meant being taken from the relative stability of the capital and shipped back south into the household of a woman known for her wickedness, permanently, as a wedding present. Ona said it herself, in the plainest possible terms, in an interview decades later. She ran, she said, because she wanted to be free, and because she had learned that after the deaths of Washington and his wife, she was to become the property of their granddaughter, this Custis woman, and she was determined never to be her slave. So she made her arrangements with the free black community of Philadelphia, one of the largest and most organized communities of free African Americans in the country, a city with an active abolitionist presence, and a network that knew exactly how to move a person out of sight. She had her things carried out ahead of her, and on the evening of May 21st, while the President and the First Lady ate their dinner in the house on Market Street, Ona Judge walked out and was hidden. Free black sailors and dock workers got her onto a ship. The vessel carried her north, up the coast, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a port town far from Virginia, in a state where slavery was fading, where she might disappear into a working population and never be found. The Washingtons discovered she was gone and reacted the way an owner reacts to the loss of valuable property. They placed a runaway advertisement in the Philadelphia papers. It ran within days. It offered a $10 reward, and it included a detail that tells you how completely they failed to understand the woman who had just left, because the ad stated that there had been no suspicion of her going, and no provocation for it. No provocation. She had just been informed she was to be given away, and the people giving her away wrote in a newspaper that they could not imagine why she would go. Now, hold on to that ship to Portsmouth, and hold on to the fact that Washington had a specific legal weapon available to him, because this is where the story turns from an escape into something that reaches all the way up into the office of the presidency and exposes something the first president spent real effort keeping quiet. 3 years earlier, in 1793, George Washington had signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. It was a federal statute, and it gave an enslaver the legal right to cross state lines, seize a person who had escaped, and compel their return. Washington had signed it. It was his law, and when his own maid escaped, he had, in principle, the full authority of that law to send men after her and drag her back to Virginia. He chose not to use it openly, and the reason he chose not to is the quiet, damning center of this whole story. Ona Judge was recognized in Portsmouth. A young woman named Elizabeth Langdon, the daughter of a United States senator and a friend of Washington's granddaughter, saw Ona on the street. She knew her by sight, because Ona had been Martha Washington's maid, a familiar figure in the households of the powerful. Ona tried to avoid her. Elizabeth understood immediately that something was wrong, and she reported what she had seen. Word made its way back to the president, so now Washington knew where she was, and here is what he did with that knowledge. He did not send federal marshals with a warrant under his own Fugitive Slave Act. Instead, he wrote privately to his Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, and asked him to handle it. Wolcott in turn contacted a man named Joseph Whipple, the collector of customs at the port of Portsmouth, a federal official, a taxman, and asked him to get Ona back. Quietly. The instruction, in Washington's own concern, was that it be done in a way that would not, in the language of the correspondence, excite a mob or a riot. Read what that means. The President of the United States, holding a law he himself had signed that would have let him seize her in the open, deliberately chose to work through back channels, a Treasury Secretary, a customs officer, specifically so that the public would not find out that George Washington was hunting a young woman to force her back into slavery. He was not worried about the legality. The law was his. He was worried about the spectacle. He was worried, the historians who have studied the letters conclude, about his reputation and about the fragile question of where the nation's capital would permanently sit, and about the growing number of Americans who were beginning to find the sight of the great general chasing an enslaved girl distasteful. The secret George Washington was protecting was not hers, it was his own. Joseph Whipple, the customs collector, went and found Ona Judge and spoke with her, and what happened in that conversation is the thing that makes Ona Judge more than a footnote, because she did not hide and she did not beg. She negotiated. With the President of the United States, through his agent, this 22-year-old woman who had been property her entire life sat down and made terms. She told Whipple she would consider returning voluntarily on one condition: that she be granted her freedom after the deaths of the Washingtons, that she not be handed to the granddaughter, not be property forever, but be freed when her current owners died. Whipple himself thought this was reasonable. He relayed it, and the Washingtons refused. They refused because the request contained something they could not concede. Ona was asking to be freed, and if the president agreed to free a maid because she ran away and demanded it, then every enslaved person at Mount Vernon would understand exactly how freedom could be obtained. Martha Washington was not going to reward the escape of her body servant with the very thing the escape had been for, so they said no. And having said no, they told Whipple to put her on a ship and send her back anyway. Whipple would not do it. He wrote back that forcing her onto a vessel could spark exactly the kind of scene at the docks: a mob, a riot, abolitionist sympathizers, public outrage that Washington had specifically ordered him to avoid, so the customs collector, tasked with quietly retrieving the president's runaway maid, declined to physically abduct her, and the first attempt collapsed. Ona did not board the ship. She stayed free. She also, in Portsmouth, began building the life that the Washingtons had been unable to imagine when they wrote that there was no provocation for her leaving. She married. His name was Jack Staines, a free black sailor, and she became Ona Judge Staines. They had children, 3 of them. She was a wife and a mother, free, in a small northern port, living the ordinary life that the law said she was not entitled to. Washington did not let it go. This is the part that reveals how much her escape had gotten under his skin. Even after the first failure, he tried again. In 1799, the last year of his life, 3 years after she left, he sent his nephew, Burwell Bassett, to New Hampshire to try to recover her, and by now, not only her, but the child she had borne in freedom, because under the law her children were property too, born to an enslaved mother. Bassett went to Portsmouth. He made inquiries, and by the account that comes down to us, a local senator who had been asked to help with the seizure was uneasy enough about it that he quietly sent word to Ona to warn her. She took her child and hid, went to stay with a free black family in a town outside Portsmouth until the danger passed. The president's nephew went home without her. That was the last attempt. George Washington died in December of 1799, and with his death, the pursuit ended not because anyone freed her, but because the man who wanted her back was gone. Here is the legal fact that Ona Judge lived with for the rest of her life, and it is important that it not be softened. She was never legally freed, not by Washington, who could have freed her with a stroke of the pen and refused. Not by Martha, who died in 1802 still holding the claim. Under the law, Ona Judge remained, until the day she died, a fugitive. Legally, she was still property, the property first of the Washington estate, and technically, because of that intended wedding gift entangled with the Custis granddaughter, she was a free woman in every way that mattered to her and a fugitive in every way that mattered to the law, and she lived in that gap for 50 years. Her life in New Hampshire was hard. Her husband Jack Staines died, leaving her a widow with children in a place with a hard climate and few resources for a poor black woman. She worked. She relied at times on the help of the county and on a free black family she had grown close to. She lived, by the plain description of the people who eventually found her, in poverty. And then, near the end of her life, the reporters came. In the 1840s, the abolitionist movement was looking for exactly her kind of story, living proof, in a human voice, of what slavery was and what the revered founders had actually done. In 1845, a reporter from an abolitionist newspaper called the Granite Freeman traveled to Greenland, New Hampshire, and knocked on the door of a simple house near the coast, and found inside an old woman described as withered in her 70s. It was Ona Judge Staines, once the favorite maid of Martha Washington, once the woman who dressed the First Lady of the United States in fine clothes, now aged and poor on the New Hampshire shore. He interviewed her. A second interview followed in another abolitionist paper, and because of those two conversations, we have something almost no enslaved person of that era left behind. Ona Judge, in her own words, explaining exactly why she did what she did. She told them she had run because she wanted to be free, and because she had learned she was to be given to the Custis granddaughter and had resolved never to be that woman's slave. She told them, with a precision that must have unsettled her interviewers, that in the household of George Washington, the household presented to the world as the very seat of American virtue, she had never received the least bit of moral or mental instruction. She had been well dressed and she had been property, and the two were not in conflict, and she had understood the difference completely. And then the reporter asked her the question that the whole story turns on: whether she regretted it, whether, having chosen poverty and hardship and a life on the run over comfort and security in the home of the founder of the country, she was sorry. The reporter wrote that a fire kindled in her aged eyes. "No," she said, "I am free, and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means." She died on February 25, 1848. She was around 75 years old. She had outlived George Washington by nearly half a century. She had outlived Martha Washington and the granddaughter she had refused to serve, and very nearly everyone who had ever tried to own her. The Fugitive Slave Act that the president had signed and declined to use against her in the open was still the law of the land when she died, and under it she was, at the moment of her death, still legally a fugitive, still, on paper, the unrecovered property of a family of the most famous man in American history. She died free anyway. She had decided the matter herself at the age of 22 at a dinner hour in Philadelphia, and she never once revised the decision. There is no grand monument to Ona Judge. For most of 2 centuries, she was a minor entry in the vast record of American slavery, a runaway advertisement and a pair of yellowed interviews, a woman whose defiance of the first president was quietly left out of the story the country told about him. She has been recovered more recently, a serious biography, a marker, a place in the histories that are finally willing to say that George Washington owned people and hunted them. But the most complete monument she has is the one she built herself, in her own voice, in that house in Greenland, when a stranger asked an old and impoverished woman whether the price of her freedom had been too high, and she looked at him with the fire still in her eyes and told him no. She had walked out the door while they were eating dinner, and she had been right.